Live. Hi everyone, and welcome to our latest episode of the Manifesto Read. My name is Ayo.
And I'm OJ, your co-host.
Yes, we are indeed, and we are back for our second installment this season. So as you probably are aware, we had intended to do 100 days recording to kind of review the government's policies 100 days in, which would have been on the 21st of March. But as you are all definitely well aware, the events of COVID-19 have taken precedence, and so we have decided to take a different tack. So we are spending this season looking at the government's response to the COVID-19 crisis. We first recorded an episode earlier on in the week, I believe it was on Wednesday or Tuesday, I think it was, on health and social care and the government's response to the coronavirus crisis in health and social care. And today we have a series of panelists, as you can probably see on our split screen, who are going to be talking us through the impacts of the virus on education and the government's approach. Some of you doubtless will have kids at home over the next few weeks, which you weren't expecting to be at home. So we're going to hear from our experts what they have to say on the matter.
And as always, guys, remember that you can follow us on Twitter at Manifesto Read. You can follow us on Instagram at The Manifesto Read, or you can email us at themanifestoread@gmail.com if you have any questions or any feedback. And please do like, subscribe, and leave a review. If you are watching us on the live stream, then Ayo and I both have our phones with us. And so if you contact us via any of those means, we'll be able to answer any questions that you may have for our panelists. And speaking of our panelists, let's move over to them and allow them to reintroduce themselves. You'll be familiar with each of them from the series 1 recording. And if they're new to you, well, you're going to make friends with them now. So first we have Charlotte Nichols.
Hi, I'm Charlotte Nichols. I'm Deputy Head Teacher of a large comprehensive secondary school in Surrey. We've got nearly 2,000 children on roll. I'm also Director of Teacher Training across our partnership of 10 schools which span the county. And with everything going on with COVID-19 and the school closure, I'm currently, along with the head and the other deputies, managing the kind of continued partial opening of the school for key workers, students and vulnerable students, organising remote learning for those who are not in school, and kind of working on how we support key workers as much as we can, and also teachers as key workers.
Brilliant. And then next up, going in alphabetical order, we have Echo Oliver.
Hi everyone. My name is Ayo Afolabi, Communications Lead for Rivers Coaching. We are a social enterprise that deals primarily with education, but to do with system restructuring in a social justice lens. At the moment, because of the COVID-19 shutdown of schools, we are looking at how we're supporting schools through the process of opening, supporting the teachers, online learning, supporting parents, and a longer term response for those who are most disadvantaged before the COVID-19 outbreak, during it, and the ones who are going to be disadvantaged afterwards.
Great, very topical. And then next up we have Mr. Guy Forbat.
So I'm Guy and I'm Head of Music at William Ellis School, which is an all-boys comprehensive in Camden. I'm also the Secondary Music Coordinator for music across the borough with all 70 schools. And I am a governor at WAC Arts College, which is an alternative provision free school for students from 14 to 19. I've been in a little bit, I'm going in over Easter, but at the moment I'm mainly managing uploading as many resources as is possible to teach music over the internet, which is interesting.
Next up we have Lotus Bautista.
Hi everyone, thanks for the intro, Jake, very nice. I'm the co-founder of Volo, and we are a social enterprise that works with universities and organisations to support their career volunteering. Interesting time for us at the moment because EdTech is obviously something that's really coming to the fore in this kind of situation, and something that universities and institutions across the world are now turning to in the wake of forced distance learning. So that's something that's really interesting for us. I'm also the access coordinator at City Lit, which is an adult education college in London, and we support students to go to university. So this is also an interesting time for us in that sense. Now that exams are cancelled, in some ways access has a little bit more leverage because we are a 100% coursework-based assessed qualification, at least the way that we do things. I'm also finally a governor for a primary school in Northwest London, so I get to see how COVID-19 is affecting a large spread of the education verticals, and it's a very interesting time at the moment.
And finally, last but by no means least, Ms. Yansé Cooper.
Hey, hi all, good to be back. I think last time I was with you, I was working for Teach First as an initial teacher trainer. I have since adopted 2 roles, so I'm a part-time teacher at a large comprehensive in Brent. I teach French Wednesday to Friday. I also have a form group. I've got about 6 classes. Monday and Tuesday, I work for New Social Enterprise, The Difference. We are a programme of continuing professional development for middle leaders to leave their schools and work on the senior leadership team of alternative provisions or pupil referral units. And the idea is that we increase the quality and capacity of education for those who are most vulnerable. At this time, I'm working from home 5 days a week. I am on rota, so I've been in school last week, and the rest of my time is spent putting out fires online.
So great. So we have a wealth of experience, I think, amongst all of the panelists that we have present here. And I think I should also say that I am also a governor of a state Church of England primary school. So I've got some insight I can bring into it, but obviously we'll defer to our panelists' expertise. So as an overview, we thought it would be a good idea just to delve into where we are in terms of UK policy with the government and the solutions that they have come up with in terms of navigating this unprecedented situation that we find ourselves in with COVID-19. I believe that I can use Yansé to assist with that, of just telling us where we're at this moment in time. And because things are changing so quickly, I think it's important that we note that we are recording this on the afternoon of the 28th of March, because who knows what may happen Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday next week with the way that things are going. So yes, over to you, Ms. Cooper.
Yes, indeed. So schools, it was announced, I believe, on Wednesday the 18th that school would shut their doors after 3 p.m. in the UK on that Friday the 20th. So it's been just over a week. They stipulated that it would remain open for vulnerable children, and we'll go into exactly kind of the groups that involves, and the children of key workers who cannot otherwise be supervised at home. They announced in the same briefing that all public examinations would be cancelled, so GCSEs, A-levels, SATs, and therefore, and we've been kind of drip-fed some information since then that for GCSEs and A-levels, students would be getting calculated grades, and that will be towards the end of July. We have been advised that Ofqual will be giving us more information on exactly what that looks like the week beginning Monday, 30th. So it's an interesting one in terms of governance, because schools have had to take that information, heads of schools have had to take that information and run and interpret it as they will. And I think you'll see via our panelists quite how differently these guidelines have been interpreted. We have been asked to provide work during this period. It became apparent that we would have a role in managing children who were entitled to free school meals, those who are working kind of with multi-agency workers, and we're talking about mainstream school at the moment, and I am speaking from a secondary specialism. In terms of adult education, colleges, professional buddies, higher education, there's less obvious guidance. Many of them acted to cancel exams anyway. I wanted to put caveats on this in that, as OJ mentioned, this is live and dynamic, it's unprecedented, and a phrase that an old organisation that I used to work with went something like, we are building the plane as we're flying it. So I think as we go through the discussion, you might note a few concerns, a few frustrations already emerging, but I think it's really important that we're conscious of the fact that we are all figuring this out. The other thing I wanted to mention is this is really essentially a human experience. Illness will play a role in what happens to these institutions, bereavement, capacity, and all of those things. And also, this is a real sector-wide conversation. We don't have early years represented in this group, so we will discuss the breadth of issues as we see them, but just wanted to kind of highlight the limitations as I see them.
Thank you very much, Yansé. It was really thorough. So the first thing to speak about really is just kind of in terms of the overall strategy that the UK government has introduced. Do you guys feel as though the guidance has been correct? Do you think that you have received clear guidance as teachers? Do you think that parents are receiving clear enough guidance themselves, and that students are having like enough of an understanding of exactly what's happening with them? Charlotte?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the government...
If I can jump in here. Oh.
Sorry, latest, Charlotte. Then we'll come to you.
I think that the government is doing what it can to some extent. You know, this is, as we've said, a very strange situation to be in, and they have to make decisions. And there was a lot of pressure on the government from the schools to close because it wasn't sustainable to keep them open. Basically, it wasn't safe either, and therefore, inevitably, it was going to take a while for the information to come through. That being said, I think that there has been a lack of or a slow trickle of information about how we should be managing this, and a lot of expectation on schools to provide a service that they've never provided before, or in a way that they've never provided it before. So you know, for me, it's yes, okay, remote learning, that's a thing we've got to get used to, but as technology's been advancing through teaching, I think people have that's actually less of an adjustment than, for example, providing free school meals to children who are entitled to them when the children can't come to school. You know, the government saying provide vouchers and we'll reimburse you. Very much appreciate the sentiment of being reimbursed. That's not something we're used to, I think, as schools. But actually, how do you do that, and how do you safely get vouchers to the right people that they can actually use? I mean, I work in a school where we have people coming from lots and lots of different areas, and to get vouchers that they can use, they need ones for different supermarkets, for example. It's just not very pragmatic. So in that's just one example of kind of the detail that you would usually have in a government policy that just isn't there at the moment.
Lotus, you said you wanted to jump in as well, and then we'll go over to Yansé.
Yeah, I think that, as Charlotte said, the right sentiment and the right idea is there, and Yansé's already highlighted that we're building the plane as, what was the phrase? We're building the plane as we're flying it, and I think that that's really coming through. The thing that I wanted to highlight, though, is that, like the NHS, a lot of support for the wider system is falling on education, particularly on schools at primary and secondary. And you know, a lot has been thought about for the economy, which is completely right, but the practicality of how you give a lot of dependence on the education sector to support the community in this moment, as Charlotte said, it needs to be clarified, but I understand why it's not. It's just something to highlight that there is a lot of pressure falling on schools in particular to help vulnerable groups as well as other groups at a time when they don't really have enough guidance to do so and have never done so previously in such a way. Schools do a lot for the community, but in the way that Charlotte said is very different. So it's something.
And Yansé?
I think it's interesting. There are a couple of things that really spring to mind. I think the room for interpretation, as I mentioned before, that has fallen on different head teachers means that some schools are opened and the expectation is that staff come into work, and social distancing is just having fewer kids there. There are schools that use rotas. So for example, if I were living with my parents, with my grandmother there, that would be an interesting concept to kind of not have 2 weeks free. So there are different interpretations of what this should look like for teachers. Because it's so different to other sectors, and there's a bit of a different schools are islands and they have different ways of working. I also think in terms of principle and in terms of a real clear articulation of what our purpose is, as Lotus started to say, there's a bit of ambiguity. Are we there to support well-being, mental health, to provide bereavement services? I think there were certain things that we were struggling with already in terms of supporting the most vulnerable, the people with the lowest income, that are all coming to a head here. And without the articulation of what you are now as a school, knowing that we cannot be what we've been up to this point, that mismatch or that lack of clarity is meaning that we've got a lot of really interesting, dynamic, different practices emerging. But what could happen in that time is a lot of kind of infection and, you know, the spreading of the virus. And I think we'll get onto what that might look like and who's mixing and what social distancing looks like in schools where there just isn't that clarity that's come with that guidance.
Just quickly before we move on, I think that was a really interesting point that you raised there, Yansé, around what you guys do as teachers and when you come in, when you don't. Has there been any sort of clarity in terms of guidance that's been given to you as individuals as to what factors in your home situations should dictate whether or not you should be a teacher that goes in, or whether you should be a teacher that maybe does the online teaching, if that's something your school offers? Guy's got his hand up, and then I'll go over to Charlotte.
It's just like a school, isn't it?
Really?
I think it's different for different schools, and this is the whole issue with their schools being islands. So where I've been, I think they've been relatively transparent. We all filled in a form, and then they put us into one of 4 categories, which was you live close to school, you're not living with anyone that's at risk, you're not at risk, and you can get to school via cycling, walking, or by car without sharing. And then it went down to I have to get public transport to get in, but I'm not at risk. And then people that are living at risk or are over 50 and really are at risk, or living with people that are at risk. But as I think Yansé highlighted, there are some schools that are using it as an excuse to say, well, that's great, everyone has to come in still, otherwise you don't get paid, and you're just going to plan lessons and deliver things as usual during normal school time, which personally I don't think is the best. But that's the issue with not having clear government advice. You can't go to the union because there's nothing to actually complain about because it's not clear.
That's interesting. So I am going to come to you, Charlotte. Just the comment that you made there, Guy, about some schools saying that if you don't go in, you wouldn't get paid. So does that mean that despite the fact that there is the government grant which has been provided for employees, which you as teachers are, where you should qualify, I would have thought, or the schools could qualify for the grants to continue to pay their teachers up to £2,500 a month, are there still schools that are saying, even if you don't come in for reasons pertaining to COVID-19, that you wouldn't get your salary?
I mean, basically it's people going rogue rather than actually an official school policy, but that's the problem. Yeah. It's where there's the ambiguity. So someone might say, and I've heard sort of off the record, lots of different people saying this on Twitter, for example, maybe you live with other people who have previously had some form of respiratory disease, but they aren't technically in the at-risk category. And you're just saying, I don't want to come home. I've got 8 flatmates that are all working from home. If I come back and they all get it, they know they've got it from me. I don't want to be that person, for example. Now, that's not fitting very neatly into the I am over 65 risk category. And in that respect, there will be certain unscrupulous establishments that may just say, you've got to come in unless you're in this category, this one or this one. Sorry.
Interesting.
Yeah, I think that there's also, schools are used to kind of being really strapped for cash. That's been a problem. We talked about it in the last podcast. But also in kind of the staff are used to working kind of as much as possible, and leadership teams are used to having to ask people to work as much as possible. And of course there are also some that are more unreasonable than others, I would say, but schools shouldn't have that issue in terms of the income, because obviously it's the money comes from the government. So private schools aside, for state schools for a moment, they shouldn't be needing to apply for money to pay the salaries, because the money is still coming in for all the students, even though not all the students are there. So there's no legitimate reason to say we need you in because we're paying you, because that's going to be okay no matter what. So it is, I think, opportunistic if senior leadership teams are saying everyone needs to come in. I think that in the vast majority of cases people are being asked to work on a rota of some description, and in secondary schools, there have been a lot fewer children coming to school than could have been. I mean, in my school, we had, on the first day, we expected 150 students in, and we got about 45. And by now, we're down to 7 or 8 that come in. Changes depending on key working patterns, and a couple of students who are very vulnerable. But I think that there are senior leadership teams who are maybe slightly misinforming people or directing people to come in, which is unsafe. But most people, I think, are trying to minimise people coming in.
Guy?
Just very quickly to add to that, I think some people may not quite understand yet that it doesn't mean that schools are open and children of key workers and vulnerable students should come in. It's saying it's open for them to come in if they wish to. So again, we've got about 7 students only coming in. But the priority really at this point, from what I understand, is actually social distancing and people not coming into contact with each other. So if you can afford to stay at home because you've got one key worker parent and another parent who's working from home, and therefore they can look after you, that's absolutely fine. And I think it's probably preferred.
Yeah, so guidance that we were discussing on the health episode with doctors and those who work in healthcare policy was that really the emphasis at the moment is just on making sure that the disease is as contained as possible. And even if that does mean that certain aspects, such as unfortunately things like mental health, things like other issues and so on, kind of fall to one side, the priority is just on flattening the curve and making sure that that is pushed forward. So as a barrister, I'm one of the people who's classified as a key worker, but the guidance that we've received is that if it is possible for you to stay at home, that you should do so. And if you can find a way for your child to be looked after at home, even if their school is open, and even though technically we can take our children to school as key workers, we should make every effort possible to keep them at home rather than taking them in. So it seems as though the emphasis on school being physical presence at school is very much a last resort if there's no other option, rather than encouraging people to continue as normal. Yansé, I think you had your hand up.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I think we've given quite a lot of airtime to the kind of few unscrupulous head teachers, etc. I think by and large, it's the picture is what Guy described, that they're asking teachers kind of what groups they fall into, what risks they're managing, and they are sensitively organising rotas. What became a kind of out of our hands anyway when the lockdown happened is that we're not going to, if we're on the road, to have 2 weeks of non-contact, but generally I think there is a sensitivity. I think there is great fear among kind of the different leaders in terms of what this might look like, but I think generally schools are acting ethically, and they're thinking really carefully about the risks to their staff, as they were in the week leading up to this announcement. And I think the pressure on the government told in terms of them having to collapse classes. I know in my school they were sending staff home already the week preceding if they had vulnerable people at home. What I think is really interesting, and I know that one of us is going to start covering safeguarding of the staff and children from illness in school, and how to not spread. I think that's something that there might be kind of bits of great practice with, but it isn't coming through in terms of clear guidelines, protection, clothing, etc.
So we'll go to Guy, and then we'll go to Lotus, and then we'll move on to the next area of discussion.
Yeah, just to quickly add on that, I think there could be more clarity in terms of what social distancing should be happening in playgrounds, especially in primary schools. I've got members of friends who are members of staff at primary schools, and you can't socially distance with a vulnerable 4-year-old. They're going to come and hug your leg. So there are staff that I think do still feel like they can unfodder a little bit. And that's a massive challenge, because schools are saying, well, it's our obligation to do that. But many teaching staff are saying, I did not sign up. Maybe like doctors did with the Hippocratic Oath, saying, I'm going to stand, and take the first bullet. I'm a teacher. And that's just a really hard dynamic for senior leaders to try and balance with, in terms of the responsibilities to look after vulnerable children as well.
I also just find it as an outsider quite interesting, because a lot of the emphasis that we have, so for example, the safeguarding training that I had to do as a school governor was all about maintaining distance from children, and this kind of idea of making sure that you don't have any physical contacts and so on. And then I feel as though quite in the reverse, now you guys have become these sort of caregiving practitioners in a way where, for some people who I work with, they were discussing how really they're seeing having to take their children to school as daycare rather than as an educational thing, and how strange they find it that these teachers are now being given that role for their children at what is a very distressing time for them, when all of the years preceding has been all about how teachers need to kind of like stick to this educational role and move away from the sort of caregiving aspect of things. All right, so if we go over to Lotus and then we'll move over to our deep dives of the different levels of education that we have on our notes.
It was, sorry, I think there's also a slight delay on my, because my connection is not very good, but essentially what I wanted to flag was the whole, what Yansé was saying about the sanitation practices and again, the kind of lack of guidance. If you are a key worker that is bringing your child to school and it's absolutely necessary, there are no other options, potentially you are a healthcare worker who is in contact with COVID-19 and very closely in contact with COVID-19. So then that raises an issue of the fact that if you are mixing the children of people who are key workers and doing the right thing, that they're sending their kids to school because there's no other option, what are you doing then to keep the vulnerable children safe from contraction? Because then you create a cycle of contraction, right? Which is the whole point of social distancing. Actually, whilst the sentiment is really good to give vulnerable children and the children of key workers a safe place to be during the day, what does that safety mean when in schools, you know, they're not loaded with hand sanitizer, there are no gloves, there are no masks to protect those children? How much are you actually protecting them really, other than giving them a physical building to be, when they might go home, and if they are vulnerable, potentially they're being cared for by older relatives, grandparents, aunts, uncles. They've been in contact with a child whose parent is a doctor or nurse that has COVID-19. They're going to bring that home, and then you create a whole cycle of contraction. So that's the kind of thing that I think the sentiment is right, but again, schools need much clearer guidance as to how to do that properly in a socially distant way that does flatten that curve. Because at the moment, that's not particularly clear, I think, and I would love to know what others think.
I mean,
sorry, yeah, let you go first, Charlotte.
Well, no, just that I've obviously been kind of one of the leaders doing this, implementing this in a school, and that has been our top priority. And it, you know, it can sound harsh in a way to say, you know, we're prioritizing first and foremost protecting the staff because they're older, and we know that this illness is worse for people who are older. And then also from the children from each other, without creating further social kind of segregation, because of course the vulnerable children, not always but very often, are already ostracized to some extent in their communities, within the school community. And if we then say, well, you're vulnerable, you need to go in one room, and your key worker children need to go in another, we're contributing to a different problem. So it is really difficult, but we have set up quite strict practices. We've got rooms that the children sit in. They have a designated desk, a big gap, more than 2 meters, and then another designated desk. They don't, that's the only desk they use. If they enter the area, they have to wash their hands. We do have alcohol gel available, and also our staff are actually monitoring from outside the classrooms at their own desk. And again, they have their own desk that they don't move from, or they don't switch desks during the course of the day, and everything's then disinfected. That's the best we can do, but we are not professionals in this, in that field by any means. And we have not received any guidance from anyone about, proper cleaning practices. For example, we're using what we feel is common sense, but we don't know how long this stuff lives on things, and whether our cleaning products even are sufficient.
I think we're going to move into the next section. I think Charlotte, and actually Charlotte, it's probably aimed at you again, but obviously looking at nursery and kind of early education, so nursery reception, kind of like our youngest in education, there are obviously a lot of implications that the COVID-19 has on them, particularly looking at kind of the workforce in terms of their parents and their carers, and kind of the impact of them being out of nursery and reception that has on them. Impacts obviously on socializing. We've heard Guy kind of point out quite clearly that social distancing being applied to young toddlers and young children is going to be quite difficult. But can you kind of speak to more of the issues that are being experienced, particularly in the early education?
Yeah, I mean, I'm obviously a secondary specialist, but I have a toddler who goes to nursery regularly, and it's been very interesting speaking to them professional to professional, as well as just as a parent, about how they are managing this situation. And the early years curriculum, I think, is brilliant for young people, but it absolutely relies on the professionals delivering the material. And the nursery that my son goes to, he has we get the scheme of work, so we get a weekly plan of what's going to happen in the week. I can read that, and as a teacher, I still can't deliver that to him at home. So it is really difficult if they've built an entire scheme of work around a particular book and there are certain goalposts that they're moving towards, without explaining those in detail to parents, it's very hard for parents to interpret it. And of course, whereas, you know, most of us remember at least something of going to primary school and secondary school, not many of us remember detail about what we learned and why at nursery school. And also how you get that balance between learning and play, because obviously that's the skill of being an early years provider. And I think that it maybe shows us something about how we have not necessarily valued early years provision in the same way. And as soon as you, as a parent, get your child at home and go, oh my goodness, I don't know what I'm doing, it does really show you something. And I, you know, certainly for me, it's really thrown into relief as a teacher myself, still not being able to understand how to deliver the curriculum. I really feel for parents who have no experience of teaching, because it is a really difficult thing to manage, I think.
Yeah, the number of parents, parents of young children who I've seen on social media post that to every carer out there for young children or teacher young children who's done this for year in, year out, they deserve to be paid they deserve to be paid the amount CEOs are paid, because literally it is such a skill, because they've literally put day 5 of home learning, I want to die.
Yeah.
You know, so and Guy actually you know, I want you to kind of speak more to this notion of kind of social distancing not being possible, and kind of speaking about some of your colleagues' experiences on this.
Yeah, so I had a brief phone call with a friend who works at a couple of primary schools in a music capacity just a couple of days ago. And first of all, you actually, as well as the social distancing, you've got the problem that you've got different staff in every day. So you might have the same 4 kids, but they will come into contact with 20 different members of staff coming in on the rota, and it is physically impossible. The concept of social distancing for some kids is they're just not going to get it, but if they're used to learned behaviors are running around, again, especially if you've got vulnerable kids, or to be fair, any kid is just going to get excited and play when they're with other children. So it is impossible to establish that, from what I understand, in primaries, although there might be primary schools that are effectively doing that in some way, which means that staff are really at risk.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think we're going to move over to the next deep dive. OJ, over to you.
Yeah, so if we now move into the secondary education, which I think is the area that most of you are most comfortable working in. One of the big areas of policy that has come out, or big decisions that have come out, is obviously the movement to not have exams. There's no, as I understand it, no GCSEs, no AS, no A2 levels being held, and I assume the same for IB as well. So just on a very basic level, for those of us who've not been to secondary school for about 14 years, what does that actually mean?
You're old.
I know I'm old, but look at my skin, I'm so young looking. But generally, if you are a student who was about to take these exams, what will your grades now be based on? And I'll ask that question to Yansé.
I think 2 things come up here. One is what's actually going on. So the calculated grade is going to look exactly the same as the GCSE, A-level kind of grades that they'll receive in exactly the same format. What it is the teacher puts forward the grade, and it will probably be something like the prediction, and it will be then, I guess, moderated with prior attainment, how the rest of the country's doing, to make sure that there's the kind of the bell curve, etc., so that it's as close to what the reality should be. And they keep talking about, this cohort not being disadvantaged, but as we're really pressing the matter on the already disadvantaged kids in this cohort being further disadvantaged. Now, the flip side of that is the messaging. Now, depending on how your year 11s, in my case, turned up on the day after that announcement, you needed to message that in a particular way. Ours came in rambunctious, kind of overexcited, little liable to trashing a few bits and bobs around the building, and had to be told, hold on, you need to engage with us. This isn't about you. This is a national kind of, this is a global pandemic. And for me, in the back of my mind, I'm thinking, if they go off and they don't engage with learning for 6 months, what happens to the next level? So the message that they needed to hear was, you will get your mock grades unless you keep engaging with us. And it's a really, like, this is why I keep bringing back the human element of this thing. We're managing and we're getting through Pred education information, and I'm still engaging with my year 11s, and some of them are saying, okay, if I then, with that message, if I then work really hard from home, can you predict me, if I all of a sudden improve remotely to some different, for French, all of a sudden everybody is fluent in Google Translate. Not everybody, but the ones that really, if I improve this amount, can you do X, Y, and Z to my prediction? And so there is something about messaging that we're having to do, something kind of political in there that we need to keep engaging with. I think the key thing that I came up with last time, and that's, I'm going to bang on about it, is what the effect that teacher assessment has on disadvantaged children and BAME children. And I think we understand that when we look at disadvantage in general, and I'm talking about low income, the fact that teacher assessments, that they tend to do better in anonymized kind of state assessments than they do with teacher assessment, because we bring our biases in there. We're starting to talk about that. We are not talking about the fact that that will intersect with if you are a BAME child, etc., etc., etc. And the fact that we're not talking about that on a school level, that head teachers are not naming that and saying, therefore, I'm going to hold heads of departments accountable to making sure that this doesn't happen. Therefore, we're going to upskill and take this time to upskill on these biases. That's a bit of a, again, that's a flabby area that some schools will think about and some schools won't. And I think the majority of schools won't, because this isn't a dialogue that we're having necessarily nationally. So I'm seeing it as a think piece in The Guardian, where you'd expect it to be, but not a national conversation. So when I'm thinking about these transitions, these SATs, these GCSEs, these A levels, there's a fear of them having enough knowledge to access the next step, but then being kind of disadvantaged twice, 3 times by whatever their structures at home have or haven't been able to provide them. And the fact that the teacher's got that kind of, that is bringing their biases to it. And I'm talking about good, fantastic, fair teachers all being susceptible to this.
Has there been talk or discussions for moderation of these assessments? Has that been something that's been considered?
So the moderation will be, okay, is this is this grade plausible based on their prior achievement? But is that enough? Is that enough? Yeah. Is moderation, have you engaged with this bias? Is moderation, what have they learned? What have their structures been at? Like, what have they overcome, or those types of things? And I think these are the questions, because they're not asked, that really don't serve our disadvantaged students.
All right, we'll go to Lotus and then to Charlotte.
I think also, from what I was a secondary English teacher, and I still tutor because I want to maintain my teaching practice. But what I think is really interesting on basing things on mocks and things like that is that sometimes students engage because they think, I've got so long. Time when you're 16 doesn't feel the same as when you're 30. You think there's an exam in 6 months and you think, God, that's ages away. So maybe you start to engage in April. And it's still March right now, and you're thinking, oh, it's fine. But then in April, you get this big boost. It was known in my school as the fear. You get the fear, and your working productivity goes up exponentially. So maybe in your mocks, you were sitting at a D, and your parents were, not particularly happy with you.
A 4.
But you get to April, and you think, or a 4, a 4 now, and then in the new grading system, you get a 4, maybe even less. You get a 3 or a 2, depending how much you didn't want to revise. And then you get to April and your parents are like, you've got a 2 in your mocks. You need to get at least a 6 or 7 or 8 or 9, depending on your background or just your personal expectation. And you boost yourself in that last moment. So I think, teacher assessment is really good, but sometimes also as teachers, as Yansé said, we have biases, and sometimes the kids, they don't want to engage until a certain point because it just seems so far away. So what do you do about in that scenario? For my students, the announcement that exams weren't happening was actually a real kick in the teeth, because they were the students who really, were not happy with having to, they weren't vibing with the system, let's say, but then they thought, you know what, I really want to do well for myself. And they had been working incredibly hard from September to this point, thinking, oh, it's nearly in sight, I can nearly touch that exam, to then be told after 6, 7, 8 months of working incredibly hard, there was really no point of that. That's a hard pill to swallow.
Even as somebody who went to, I went to quite a decent academically strong private school. And even then, the trend was always that the students, whatever grades you got in your mock exams, the teachers would accept that you'd get at least half a grade higher in your actual and your final exams. And so there were a couple of situations. I remember there were a couple of students in my year who, for various reasons, were unable to take certain exams. And the approach that the teachers at my school took was that they would look at what you had done in your mocks, and then as long as you'd done 1 or 2 essays, assessments, whatever, since then, which had received a higher grade, they would lean your predicted grade, or which would become your actual grade, as the higher version of that. But that took a sort of in-depth knowledge of that teacher had of that student. It took the fact that, you know, private schools are very invested in making sure that their students receive A's and A stars, so they can, yeah, exactly, because that's you know, how they justify the amount of money that they demand from parents each year, and so on. And I think it's very interesting to I remember this book that I always go on about. I just grabbed it from my bookshelf, called Slay in Your Lane, which talks about education. And it talks about the perception of Black females and male students, and how they are very often undergraded by their teachers, how they had to introduce in various countries, the UK included, anonymised testing to ensure that those students were not underpredicted in terms of their grades. And then after the anonymisation, their grades would shoot up. So it was nothing to do with their performance, it was to do with that sort of perception. And yeah, so bringing in that human element, that subjective element, increases the opportunity for prejudice to enter into the grades. And I know that's something that, Ecole, that you work with quite a lot through Rivers Coaching. Is that something that you guys, you've mentioned that your company is trying to help schools with practical tips as to how to navigate this type of situation? Is this an area that you guys have been consulted about with any of the schools that you work with? Don't forget you're on mute, by the way.
Of course, I was going to talk in silence for a while. So we haven't even gotten onto the testing part, because at the moment we're just still looking at the support of students in terms of the distance learning. But I think it's more to Yancey's point that she'd made, and I was going to say a lot of the things that came out in our previous episode really, like, I think coming to the fore now. Because of this crisis, all of the lack of provision for the most vulnerable students, especially, and in particular BAME students, a lot of the undertraining of staff in terms of, dealing with, I hate the unconscious bias thing, because I think it's, people want to say it's unconscious, I think it's conscious most of the time, but we just don't see a problem with it. Because we're just accustomed to, well, this is how life is. This is the way that we normally do things, and we've all got them. But then when we're coming then into the testing element, as in, like, we're just seeing an exasperation of an already existing issue. The way we test and exam kids or young people doesn't accommodate for all those people who don't. Well, for the people who don't test well, the people who do, wait till later in the year to kick into gear, the people who come from there's some people who come from backgrounds where it's essential that all of your grades, even at the mock, at mock are, all the way up there. And if not, then that's a problem at home. So is it fair for it to be based on teacher assessment? Probably not, actually. But then that requires then some training of teachers. But at the moment, the position we're in is, because we are dealing with a crisis, teacher training in order to deal with this, with biases and so on and so forth, is, like everything else, going to take a back seat to just making sure that we can, that the kids can come in and that they can learn and all the rest of it. So
she put to Charlotte. Charlotte had her hand up previously, yeah.
Okay,
so
we'll go to Charlotte, and then we'll go to Yancey.
Yeah.
I mean, I think I completely agree with what's been said, and that the timing is also bad. And I mean, it is definitely an opportunity for training of staff, with the massive caveat that we've got a whole load of staff who are off. We've got staff. I mean, that in itself is an issue, right? If we're going to be asked in the next 3-4 weeks to provide grades, some of our staff are not going to be able to access the bank of evidence that they would have been using from school, that is located in school, because they are shielding, so they're not coming out. It's not just a 7 or a 14-day thing for them. They are stuck inside until something changes. So there's a lot here. I'm really scared of the, you know, click down the list, here's a list of grades, good luck, off you go. And you know, so training would be great, but the practicalities is difficult. And the other thing, which I think we did touch upon, is the relationship between student and teacher, not just in terms of teacher bias, which I completely agree with, but also, you know, that the least disadvantaged students, or the most advantaged students, are going to be the ones who are most likely to try now to use their relationship with their teacher, use the fact that they are seen as great students, to you know, to try and get something. I myself bumped into a student the other day who said to me, you can predict me a 7, can't you? And I said, well, hang on a second, you're on the foundation tier, the maximum grade you can get is a 5. And he said, change my tier. So it's just a case of, you know, looking at that doubling up of things, that if we're already saying disadvantaged and become more disadvantaged, advantaged are going to become more advantaged too if we're not careful.
Yeah. I think it's really important to talk really seriously about the concrete ways in which advantage and disadvantage plays out. So it's not just the money in your bank account or the food on your table. There is the option, I'm sorry, which I didn't mention earlier, where if you disagree with the grade that you've been predicted, that has been calculated on your behalf, then you can sit the exam in early on the beginning of the next academic year, and they've left that ambiguous for obvious reasons, or next summer. And my sense is, I'm sure there'll be very different interaction with that opportunity depending on advantage level. The people that can advocate for themselves, the people that feel confident after 6 months of no in-person learning to go and take that exam, that they were calculated a lower grade, you know, those types of things are going to play out as well. Whereas in my head, I'm kind of thinking, oh, should I guide certain students to actually go ahead and prepare now as if they're taking it in September? And I've been told, no, we're not going to recommend that to a student. It's up to them to decide. Well, then what social contracts are going to come into play in that decision? Is it a free decision?
Yeah. Lotus.
Yeah, I think also just in terms of raising the point of advantage and disadvantage, and what both Charlotte and Yansé have said about this not just being about money, also about access. But access is a really important thing as well. If you are expecting children to learn at home, you are making a huge load of middle class assumptions that they have access to a computer or some kind of technology where they can see what's online, that they have access to a space that is quiet and available for them to sit and do that work, and that they have a supportive environment where they can just sit for a few hours and do their work. You know, lots of families will be living in very small accommodation where that's just not possible. It might be that you have multiple siblings and all of you are trying to learn at the same time, but you have one laptop in the house that your parents need to use. Maybe you have no quiet space. You can't go outside. There's not really anywhere inside. We're making a whole load of assumptions about how children can learn at home, that actually the majority of children that live in this country don't live in those environments. So
which is really sorry to cut across. It's really interesting. I was just going to say, do you remember when we were speaking in series 1, all of these points? So first of all, that we noticed the Conservative manifesto was completely silent on the BAME teacher training, disadvantaged teacher training and so on, and dealing with those aspects. And that also that we had found it very interesting how much emphasis there was in the Labour and Lib Dem manifestos on rolling out broadband to make sure that there was accessibility for people from a wide range of background to very good quality internet. And I just find it very interesting, and this came up in the health episode, and I think it's going to come up in all of these episodes, where a lot of these factors that we have identified as meaning that these rollouts are quite difficult, this middle class bias that you were talking about, were factors that were highlighted in the Lib Dem and Labour manifestos that the Conservative manifesto did not turn its mind to. And as we were going to discuss in our 100-day episodes, were aspects that had not been introduced by this government so far. It makes you wonder how things may have been had the election gone differently. Although, you know, who's to say what would have already been implemented by now, as it came along so quickly. Echo, you've had your hand up for a while. Let me let you speak.
Like a good student. Yeah, so essentially it was what Lotus is saying was like one of the first conversations we had as a team was, oh yeah, all that stuff that Labour and Lib Dems were proposing sounds real good now, doesn't it? But then going back to the beginning of you know, the episode and talking about, well, about the government's response, it's not just to do about, well, when schools would close and how we were going to assess kids, but that whole thing of like, well, okay, if we expect most people to stay home, and most teachers stay home and to do social distancing, and we're going to protect the most vulnerable, protecting the most vulnerable kids is also to do with the provision for them outside of the school environment, right? And so it is like, yeah, internet access, computer access, if you are going to be distance learning, access to resources. I know the private sector seems to have stepped up quite, or I should say more readily than the government's been able to, in saying like somewhere like Audible, where they've said, okay, we're going to give all access to, I think, young people's literature is going to be free. So you're not going to have to pay for that. And like that whole complete lack of consideration of saying that, okay, if we are going to tell people to do this, what do they need? And so at the moment, the government has sort of this ability to almost like write a blank check for a lot of resources. They can claim back later, whether it's from in how it is that they budget for schools later on, and so on and so forth. But if this is about providing the best they can, and when we're talking about that, the educational, the disadvantage gap or the advantage gap, and how that expands, like every time stuff happens that sort of closes it. So we have an anonymized testing, and then suddenly you have a closing of the gap almost immediately after you start seeing the widening again because of something else. And so this is one of those periods where maybe we didn't see it coming necessarily, but over the, I'm pretty sure over the course of the summer, you are going to see a widening of that gap again because of things like access to online resources. I'm in awe of the child who goes, well, change my tiering to you, child, because I'm like, if you don't have the confidence to do that, you don't come from a background where that's necessarily how you feel about things, there are going to be students who aren't going to take this opportunity to do all the learning they can. There are students who can't take the opportunity to do all the learning they can to be prepared for September, and then that pushes them back. And so as was my sort of like demeanor in it last season, is in like, it is really frustrating to see how all of this seems like it's going to play out, and the people who always seem to lose are going to keep losing. But because we're talking about, well, because we're social distancing, because, you know, it's a pandemic and we're just trying to protect people, it's going to be okay for them to lose.
So Guy, we'll take Guy's point, and then we'll move to the next topic. So Guy, your point to kind of round this up.
Yeah, just really quickly, as a sort of a case study at how we're dealing with distance learning. We had a conversation on Friday with all the heads of subject about having to create completely non-digital packs for certain numbers of disadvantaged students because they just don't have access to the internet. And then this is an issue with teacher workload, because we're saying, well, actually the online stuff that we've created is separate and we can't really do non-online versions. So we're going to have to create two separate parallel schemes of work. And then are we printing 100 copies of this, or are we going to post it to parents? And then, yeah, there are people that have the internet, but they only have it for like 2 hours a day. And I think lots of schools are just carrying on like normal. And I admit, yes, we're building the plane that we're flying. So I understand we're all trying our best, but it's a massive challenge for teachers to try and give the equivalent number of hours that they would normally teach. And there are some schools that have got kids online for 5 to 6 hours a day, actually doing live lessons when they would normally be doing the lessons, and the teachers having to deliver it. I've even heard a story of a teacher being observed or teaching an online lesson by another online teacher. And then giving them feedback on their online lesson, and everyone's getting to the end of the week and everyone is shattered. You know, it's just completely not sustainable. In our school, we've looked at just saying, let's do a half-term project for the kid. We upload all the resources and we signpost, because with the calls to parents that we've done, and I know we're going to chat about this in a moment, in terms of helping the students, we've got 10 students that we need to call every single week to check in with them as staff, just to see from a wellbeing point of view. And basically all the parents are just like, leave us alone. Okay, they're not saying leave us alone, but they're like, just give us a week just to get our head around everything. Like, yeah, fine. Art, you know, like art homework is important, but so is like eating and making food with and siblings communicating and getting to know each other. So it's one big massive really big challenge.
So because we've been talking about vulnerable children, we actually had 2 questions that came in from listeners. So a question from Mo and a question from Shay, and they've asked along the same lines. I'll roll them into one, which is basically what is happening to proactively assist vulnerable children for whom school would normally have been a haven. So for example, maybe you have issues around domestic abuse at home, maybe you are vulnerable in any other way. And a question that I had as well was, what are the practical things that are happening if you have a parent who is a vulnerable person, or a parent who doesn't speak English as a first language and so on, so can't navigate those teaching materials? What are the practical steps that are being put in place for people in those situations? Yansé?
I think it's really important to add some doom and gloom. Children will become more vulnerable because of this. They will be bereaved. With this kind of confinement, domestic violence will happen differently and newly in different areas. There is more vulnerability at play here. So just thought I'd say that. What is in place is please come into school. I'm going to identify you and bring you to school. So that's an option. The other thing that lots of schools are doing is kind of what Guy mentioned. So identifying, I know that our pastoral team have been working tirelessly to identify the 60, 80, 100 kids and assign them to different senior leadership staff for weekly phone calls. They have told us that safeguarding continues. So we've got specific ways to safeguard online, to escalate problems using the same escalate concerns using the same system. I'm interested, I wonder if Charlotte would have more insight in terms of how multi-agency work is going to keep continuing, us all being key workers, we're all at work, but we're certainly building that plane while we're flying it. These are the options, but I think we are going to have to be incredibly creative as more vulnerability starts to become apparent.
Yeah, Charlotte?
Yeah, my understanding is that, well, schools, a lot of the time schools are leading this again. So all the things Yansé said, I'm not going to repeat them, but I think that's fairly common practice that we are making up a system to try and manage that. I know that in my own school, the safeguarding lead wrote to the local authority to say, by the way, this is what we're doing. Are you doing anything? The one of the big things in terms of multi-agency is the kind of almost shutting down of social services, which we know already because of cuts, austerity. It's been very difficult to get social services support for children anyway. At the moment, I've spoken to a few friends who are who work social services, who are saying things like, we're being asked to go to the houses of people who are sick, but we can't do that. Other ones being told, you can't go anywhere, don't do any home visits, just make a phone call and hope for the best. And we know that that doesn't work. So I think that as we go forward, hopefully there'll be more multi-agency crossover and work than there has been at the moment. But I am seriously concerned about the well-being and safety of our most vulnerable young people, and that isn't just the obvious things that come to mind in terms of abuse that we've talked about, but families where there isn't enough money to eat, families where the parents already were working long hours, families where delivery drivers are the parents, for example. They're going to be under a huge amount of pressure now to work longer shifts, and that is going to put young people at risk because they're going to be at home on their own for a really long period of time, and nobody can check in on them because of social distancing.
Cool. So moving on to our last
1 second. 1 second. I'll switch going over to Echo.
All right.
And we'll go over to the next topic.
Okay.
Yeah, sorry. Yeah, don't talk over me. No. No, I did have, so mine was actually more of a question for the people who are teaching, because with regards to the kids who were identified as vulnerable, I know some of them also have a certain level of anonymity normally in school in terms of those vulnerability. And now where you've highlighted that actually, so school is now open to the most vulnerable kids and the kids of key workers, but the ones who are most vulnerable are definitely going to be part of the cohort. Like, what happens to that sense of anonymity and the protection that they have from that? How's that being dealt with? And then also, but then we've also got this issue of like, for the key workers who work in like really essential services where they are going to have to be working longer hours, where they are, I know I was hearing talk of like NHS workers who essentially weren't going to be able to go home for like 2 weeks or something like that because they had to stay in school, stay at the hospital and isolate from their families until they're like, what happens to all these kids? Because now we've got now we're going to have people who weren't vulnerable now becoming vulnerable as well. So what happens to them? Or is that a discussion that you guys have had in your schools?
We've definitely, the first thing about vulnerable students and their identity definitely was a big concern for us. We contacted all of the vulnerable students privately through their parents or carers, and then have brought everyone in on the basis that everyone there is key workers. So we've given them, they can obviously self-identify if they want to, but we've kind of gone with the public expression that we're looking after key workers, and that's been our way of approaching it, to try to allow them to continue the anonymity if they want to. Because also, although there's been some guidance from the government about what vulnerable means, they've also allowed schools to extend that definition to students who might not fit directly within those categories, but we know that are not safe to have to spend all day on their own. And sometimes those vulnerabilities in particular are very private. So LGBT students, for example, whose parents are not accepting of them, is an important one for them to have a safe haven. Also, students whose siblings have severe learning disabilities and they are violent, for example, again, that can be a very private thing that people don't want to share. So we've gone on the basis of everyone's a key worker child publicly.
Cool. So we're going to move into further education, and I notice you're going to cover this. If you want to roll your point previously, it's kind of roll into that. But yeah, so further education, we're looking specifically at here, so university, higher education, and also something that we realize is also part of education beyond further education, so professional qualifications, so people studying for legal qualifications, accounting qualifications, financial qualifications, accountancy qualifications. And we want to kind of discuss and delve into some of the impacts that the COVID-19 disease is going to have on these. And so handing over to Lotus to talk us through.
Yeah, sure. So obviously I'm going to talk from the experience of my particular college. I know that lots of colleges are trying to have a kind of unified approach to this. One thing is that whilst the government guidance gave a lot of support for primary, secondary, and to some extent early years, actually the guidance for higher education and colleges is not particularly clear, or professional bodies. So I think that that's one thing to highlight, that the conversation about what these organizations are going to do, which is going to be led by QAA, the Quality Assurance Association, who kind of oversees all of the higher education qualifications. They're going to discuss it in April, and that discussion is going to happen on the 2nd of April. So what I think that really highlights is that higher education, tertiary education, adult education, further education, as has been with funding, is always kind of an afterthought. So they're our institution in particular is trying its best basically to work with whatever guidance has been given and apply it across the board to our qualifications or our study. Now with our college in particular, lots of our courses they're not accredited, so there's no exam attached to them, but there are financial implications for the college. If we cannot run these courses online, which is really possible because a lot of our tutors are not trained in how to deliver online training. Even my tutors, we run an access course, and I basically had to force my tutors to teach the course online. Not that they were resistant to it, but it's a whole new learning curve, right? And we have to do that. We do have an accreditation at the end of our course, and if we don't finish the course, our students won't be able to go to university. So there is a lot riding on us, on me forcing the tutors to teach online. But then for those that are not accredited, if we don't teach those courses online and our students don't want to join those online courses, the college is going to lose a whole load of money, which has long-term implications for our future as an institution. This is an institution that has been in London for over 100 years and supported people through 2 wars, but potentially we're now facing a pandemic that we're not sure how to manage. So I think the kind of summary really for us is that professional education, adult education, has been kind of left to try and do things, trying their absolute hardest to continue, but with very, very even less guidance than other parts of education have been given, I would say.
Something that I have found really interesting about this, and sort of just kind of thinking as the conversation's developed, is that from employers' perspectives, I think this is going to be very, they're going to really need to turn their minds to this, aren't they? Because in years to come, when these students have these grades on their CVs, employers are going to have to be hyper aware of the fact that this was during the COVID-19 pandemic, and recognise that the GCSE grades, the IB grades, A-level grades, even university grades and so on, may not have been examined in the same condition as other candidates who have received grades, you know, using traditional methods. And I wonder, it's not really a question, I guess it's just me kind of thinking, I wonder how that's going to be navigated in future, when people are recruiting and when they're weighing up the emphasis that they place on the context of those grades having been achieved in that sort of way. Lotus, I think you had a response actually, and Charlotte as well.
Yeah, I think you raise a really interesting point about the purpose of exams in general, because our course is not an exam-based course, because it's aimed at adults who have been out of traditional education for a very, very long time. It's 100% coursework assessed, but it is as intense, as difficult, as frustrating as an exam-based course, which, you know, from the, it's obviously anecdotal, but from the feedback we've had from both the students and the institutions that we send them to, and they go to Russell Group universities and non-Russell Group universities, is that they are far better prepared to go to university through this method of assessment. Traditional, you know, it's all or nothing 2-hour exam, and if you don't do well, sorry. You know, that method of teaching, potentially that's also something that we need to raise. One thing I didn't touch on, again, because of time, university offers have now been paused for 2 weeks, because essentially, as I said, there's not really enough guidance as to how universities deal with this change in qualification. So they've paused giving out their offers for 2 weeks, and the deadlines have been extended, but how they're going to decide whether or not a student has a place, hasn't got a place, when the issues of the biases behind teacher assessment, there's a lot that is still at play that we're not entirely sure about. Now, for courses like mine, we're okay, because we can still give that accurate teacher assessment based on work that's come through over the course of this whole year. So potentially, should we ever have a situation, actually we're fine, other than the online delivery. Whereas if, you know, all those other issues to the A level, we've got a student that's not engaging, maybe they don't do well in exam situation, or they do well after the fear. Yeah, that's something that's still very much up in the air for all qualifications in the adult learning and tertiary space.
Great. So just conscious of time, what I propose that we do is we move on now to sort of the long-term consequences that you guys think that we'll have, and let's try and emphasise the positive as well as the negative. And then I am going to quite cheesily ask each of you what you have been doing with, although I don't think any of you had any extra free time, but what have you guys been doing during your isolation at the very least? Because I think even if you haven't had much free time, you've certainly not seen as many people as you may have wanted to. And what I'll actually ask you guys to do, and I'm putting you on the spot here, but I'm aware there are people who are listening live and will be listening later, hopefully, is maybe what we can do is, in terms of things like practical tips for parents who are homeschooling for the first time and so on, we'll share those through some mini videos on our Instagram profile. So if I'll use it as an opportunity to plug our Instagram, which is at Manifesto Read, and have a look on there for some exclusive content from the education panelists. But yeah. So guys, if we just quickly go around and talk about some of the positive and negative long-term consequences that you think. I think we've actually highlighted the negative quite a lot, so maybe if we try and emphasize some of the positive, if we can find some. So we'll do Charlotte, Guy, Yansé, Lotus, Echo, because you all seem to have something to say, which is great. Charlotte?
I think for me, it's been the opportunity for like the bond between students and teachers to improve through that really personal one-to-one connection, and in particular those students who are quieter, sometimes not seen or heard, or can, you know, fly under the radar a bit, that they are getting that opportunity to have a voice, often by email, but still and actually build up that relationship with their teachers and take responsibility for their own learning. And for me, seeing that develop in students who it probably wouldn't have done because the system fails them, I think is really great.
Guy? You need to unmute your mic. The irony is that Guy is the person who has the most experience with sound recording.
So I'm gonna echo the point in terms of the relationships with students. I've had 10 to 15-minute conversations with many students this week because I'm responsible for calling them, and I don't think I've ever had that in school, because when you're doing it, a kid runs into the classroom and something happens, and you just, in the hustle and bustle of school, you don't get 10 minutes quiet phone very often at all. And the other positive thing is this is probably some of the best BPD that just will get in their entire career. Yes, I admit, there are some negative reasons because of that, but I've got staff that have been grappling for the last 2 years in setting online homework using our personal platform because they've managed to slip through the net. And now they have to, and everyone has to understand how to use it. So even for me, uploading online resources, having smart resources that potentially I will be able to use for the whole of the rest of my teaching career, I'm actually taking this opportunity to do things I've never had the brain space and the time to do.
Yeah, I would add two things. One, again, boring relationships. When I went in, there were 4 children between key workers and vulnerable, and boy, we had a time. So they had about 3 hours of kind of time on their computers to do their sessions, and then it was creative time. So played football, I've been nutmegged untold amount of times, played badminton, we did karaoke. I mean, honestly, I was buzzing by the end of that. The other thing is, it's just a great opportunity again that Guy was mentioning. Things really shouldn't return to the way they were again. I think we've completely busted open the limitations of the system. I think in the scary thing in that year sixes have had a term and a half of year 6 and are starting secondary school now. Will there be secondary schools who extend a primary model for another term and a half? What will the response be? And because I guess we have this really devolved governance of education, there should be pockets of some really interesting, innovative, ethical ways of approaching this, and that I'm really excited to be a part of.
Yeah, for me, I think Yansé's kind of touched on it, but I think one of the positives is that basically school and education can never be the same after this, but more so from the kind of teacher workload perspective. I know that in the institutions I've worked in, and even in the school where I'm a governor, there's a lot of resistance to the use of this method, for example, or this method of teaching. But by allowing people to meet in this way and to discuss in this way, you've given them a lot of free time that really is the most valuable currency in a teacher's life. So, I've been advocating for online meetings, for example, at the school I'm a governor at, because it takes me 45 minutes to get there and 45 minutes to get back. And I've been told absolutely not possible. And now we have to do it. And I'm like, you can never tell me again that we cannot do an online meeting, because you have to do it. And this is going to save me an hour and a half of my day. I can still be part of the school community. And I'm so excited to do that. And I think if we start thinking, as Yansé said, in these much more innovative ways to harness technology, because after this, hopefully all our internet speeds will be exceptional as well. There's so much possibility out there about who can teach our kids. Do we even need a building anymore? Yes, we do. But potentially, you could have teachers from other countries teaching your children, or for specialists from other places reading your children. There are so many opportunities that this opens up for our system that if we really take advantage of it, I think it could be absolutely amazing. And the 6-month gap we're experiencing, we can make up for it, hopefully.
Echo?
Okay, sorry, I thought I was going last. So I think I'm trying to be positive about all of this, is that I think much to what everyone said is in like those connections that teachers are able to make with their students now, the advantages of being able to all those things that weren't possible before, that everyone wasn't willing to consider, that would have helped disadvantaged students, that would have helped people with, where home wasn't necessarily a safe space and all the rest of it. Looking forward, we can go, okay, well, actually, there is all this provision we can make. I know for us at Rivers, like when we're talking about how we're supporting teachers now and school leadership teams, we've said, oh, actually, maybe we need to look at our model of provision and say how can we adjust it to try and make it better, so that we can be supporting not just students and teacher relationships, but parent and school relationships as well. Because now, where parents are sort of like being given this responsibility of teaching their older children, not just, you know, the babies, you say, okay, well, how can we foster this relationship to make it more one that's more productive, one where you've got more interaction, and where you can sort of like bridge all those gaps that exist at the moment. Things shouldn't go back to the way they were. We will hope that they don't. And also the other good thing that has come out of this as well is looking at organizations like ours, like third sector organizations, and teachers who are online providing resources for other parents, for other teachers, ways to protect kids, ways to teach innovatively. And that's been really uplifting. Like going on Instagram and looking at the people who are not just with their horror stories of teaching their kids, but you know, in terms of the support that's available, that, you know, that it can provide in resources, has been amazing.
Great. Okay, that was everyone, wasn't it?
Yes, it was.
All right, so the last thing that we're going to do before we wrap up, and let's keep it super short, is can you all name one new thing that you have learnt or picked up while you have been stuck at home in the evenings? I have done the TikTok video that I spoke about last time, Ayo, and I actually think it was quite good. So
Yeah, it was all right. It was all right.
I thought so. So guys, yeah, you can find me at OEXJ. Make me TikTok famous.
It was good, but the reason why I'm sounding so so unenthusiastic is because I promised in the last episode that I wouldn't succumb to my wife's advances. Within 2 hours of saying
you were on it.
I was on TikTok with my wife doing a dance. So I'll have to concede defeat on that one in this self-isolation. Well, not self-isolation, social distancing. Get my terms right. Social distancing period. Yeah. So I've been on TikTok too.
Lotus?
I've learnt to do some nail art and indulge in my creative side, which I haven't had the chance to do for a long time, and cook.
Cooking, you?
Yeah. I mean, like, I really enjoy eating, and I can cook, but like, I have to cook now.
Guy, can you verify that, please? Not wanting to set off any.
Guy, you're on mute again. Yeah, there we go. Occasionally. Just so people who aren't aware, Lotus and Guy are actually married, and that's why we're checking with Guy. Charlotte, what have you been up to?
Well, I joined a virtual book club, but actually today I also managed to put some put a massive mirror up on the wall on my own and didn't electrocute myself. So
well done. Yansé? Yoga?
Yeah, no, that's been going really well. Zoom yoga. I actually got complimented for my side plank through Zoom, but that's not what I'm going to talk about today, guys. I've just come back from Trinidad Carnival. I'm missing the vibes. I'm missing soca, so I'll be attending a soca boat cruise this evening from my living room. I'll let you know how I get on. I don't know if I have to add the water.
I'm going to have to talk to you off air about that because I don't understand how it's on a boat, but cool. We can talk about that later.
Instant mind.
Yeah. Echo?
They're going to do it in the bathtub. But I'm trying to think, what have I done? Because I've been looking after a sick person and care and like just checking on my vulnerable parents and everything else. I haven't done.
Okay, now you're making us feel bad.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. No. That's what I want. I've learned how to make people pity me over this time. But I think I've cooked more than I have in a little while. And also realize how important, the sense of smell is and sense of taste is to other people enjoying your food.
Oh yeah, so I've lost that. So my husband's been really happy. He's been making really delicious meals that I cannot taste. That's been great. Yeah.
It's really disappointing when someone goes, this looks lovely, I can't taste it. You go, okay, it's half the pleasure gone. So yeah.
Great. So thank you guys so much for joining us and taking the time out to be on panel for our episode. And thank you very much to all of our listeners, whether you are listening live or listening back. As I mentioned before, there'll be some extra content that I've roped the panelists into creating for us, which will go up onto our Instagram, Twitter, LinkedIn, Facebook, and so on. Just type in the Manifesto Read and you'll be able to find us on it. Did I miss out on Guy? Did I miss out, guys?
I think you did miss Guy.
Oh yeah, sorry, because we just went to Guy to confirm that they just cook.
Yeah.
Sorry, Guy, what have you done? I'm sorry, Guy.
Actually doing some more exercise now. Only day I feel like an obligation to do it. I've been, I don't know about you, this is like a teacher question. Like, do you get that Sunday feeling? I don't actually get that Sunday feeling so much in the evening because I'm not in school at 7:30 a.m. So like I'm enjoying having a glass of wine on a Sunday afternoon.
Ooh.
Nice.
Nice. So exercise and wine.
Yeah.
Very nice. Okay, we are going to wrap up now.
Yes, we have run out of time.
We have got to everyone.
Yeah.
We have run out of time. But yes, please do subscribe to us on your usual podcast channels. Check us out on YouTube. Listen to us on Spotify and so on. And check out our Insta in particular for extra content. And we will be with you over the course of this week, where we'll be recording some episodes about the economy, the justice system, and constitutional affairs.
And an additional episode as well, actually. Additional episode, you forgot. So we're also recording. For some of you will be well aware that in the next few days, the Labour Party will be announcing their new leader. So we will be recording a special episode on the Labour leadership election, everything that's happened, and also with the ballot box closing before the 2nd of April, also what to expect from the 3 people that are in the final run-in, in the final runoff. So stay tuned for that episode. So that will obviously be out before the 2nd of April.
Yeah,
stay
guys,
tuned
the best way to keep updated is always to follow us on Instagram, because that's probably the channel that we update most regularly and most reliably. So thank you so much, guys, and we will catch you later.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Au revoir.